Carla McCormack from the Property Alliance.
So I'm going to start by checking everyone can hear me, because every time I speak at one of these events, somebody at the back halfway through goes, I can't hear you. So, everyone okay? Excellent. Right, so my name's Carla McCormack. I'm the Policy and Parliamentary Officer at the Poverty Alliance. For those of you who don't know who we are, the Poverty Alliance is the anti-poverty network in Scotland. We were set up in 1992 and currently have around 200 members. We work on a range of issues covering welfare reform, the living wage, housing of young people and emergency food aid. So I've been asked to talk to you about the impact of sanctions. This presentation is going to cover the impact of sanctions on claimants themselves, the choices that they're forced to make and the impact this will have on their lives. We'll look at the impact on some key groups such as lone parents and disabled people, the impact of sanctions on organisations, how they're responding to the rising pressures of welfare reform, and finally how sanctions are impacting society and local economies. My figures, I'm afraid, aren't quite as up to date as David's. These are the old ones, but you've had his. So the topic of sanctions has been moving up higher and higher up the political agenda in recent months. And this is most likely due to the fact that sanctions are being used more than ever before. Figures I have here are obviously slightly out of date now, but between October 2012 and June 2014, there were approximately 132,074 JSA sanctions in Scotland. This significant increase reflects the ramping up of conditionality, and sanctions impact all aspects of claimants' lives, but also those that work with claimants, including those who support them in advice centres, housing associations, and of course the work of people like food banks. So this here is a case study that came through from CPAG. It's about a father who was sanctioned for being 15 minutes late with his appointment with Job Centre Plus. He was sanctioned for 13 weeks, but in that time received only 2 hardship payments because he wasn't informed that he still had to sign on every 2 weeks to access them. This situation contributed to the client becoming homeless, first sleeping on a friend's floor and then sleeping rough. He was assaulted and hospitalised in this time. He now has no contact at all with his children since becoming homeless. So this shows sanctions can push people to crisis point. They're pushing people into destitution. Citizens Advice Scotland report worryingly that many of their clients who come to them for advice have already reached crisis point. They're at the stage where the disruption in their income as a result of being sanctioned has left them under exceptional pressure. And it has to be questioned really if pushing people to crisis point is actually the best way of pushing them into employment. Sanctions don't incentivise people to get back into work. Many job seekers already want to work, they express dissatisfaction with the lack of support available to them. And evidence from Cyrenians has shown that sanctions negatively impact on people's ability to find work because they have no money to travel to a job centre, they have no money to travel to interviews or to travel to libraries to complete application forms. Research also from Homeless Link found that reports of homelessness among under 25s who had experienced benefit sanctions have increased 6-fold in the space of a year. In cases such as this, it's clear that for many, the job centre is no longer a place for finding work and support, but instead it's often making life harder for people. Having no money for food and relying on others for help has negative impacts on the health of claimants, particularly their mental health. This means that for many, they may find themselves no longer fit for work and end up claiming ESA. But of course sanctions exist in ESA now as well. People with health issues often lead chaotic lives, and job centres need to consider the ways in which they support these people. There are simple changes which could be made, including how we set up appointments with people, and that would much greater affect their ability to engage with the system. So the figures shown in this slide here behind me are the results of our Welfare Trackers survey in Glasgow. This worked with organisations throughout Glasgow to track the impact of welfare reform. For this question, respondents were asked to indicate what strategies clients were implementing to deal with welfare changes. And so while the figure doesn't deal with sanctions alone, they do paint a picture. We can see that people are cutting back on food, getting into debt and falling behind on their rent. Many sanction claimants are left with little or no money to feed themselves and their families. 97% of CAS advisors recently reported that they had spoken with claimants who have skipped meals as a result of being sanctioned. This leads to many turning to food banks for help. In many cases, they're even referred to food banks by the DWP. Research from the Trussell Trust found that over half of referrals to food banks in 13-14 were as a result of benefit changes or delays, including sanctions. There's been a huge growth in the amount of food aid provision available in Scotland, and volunteers are doing good work, but it's vital that food banks do not become a part of our social security system. At a recent Poverty Alliance networking event in Clydebank, it was argued that food banks were facilitating sanctions from the DWP. This is clearly something we want to avoid. Food banks should not become part of our social security system. It's also important to think about the impact that attending a food bank has on someone's self-esteem and mental health, and the wider costs of that. So this next case study came to us as part of our research into emergency food aid provision in Scotland. We spoke with Craig at a food bank. This whole story is in Craig's own words. Craig's a 30-year-old man. He lives in East Ayrshire, and he's accessed food banks on a few occasions as a result of his sanctions. You're going to have to forget the accent here. Craig's going to speak like he's from Belfast. Over the past 2 months, I was sanctioned by the DWP. Basically, I've had no income, no means of getting food, so I've been relying on the food bank and stuff like that. And see, if it wasn't for them, basically I'd have nothing at all. Craig continued. At the time, I was meant to be doing a daily sign-in, but I told my coach worker that there was no way I could do that. I said, I've got community service on a Tuesday, a Wednesday and a Thursday. I said I can come in and sign in on a Monday and a Friday, and that's no problem at all, but the other days I can't do it. I don't finish community service until 4:30, and by the time I get to the job centre, it's closed. The next thing I knew, I got a text message saying that my claim had been closed, so I had to go and open a new claim. I eventually got a payment today, which was for £12. I was expecting around 140. So now I'm going to have to phone the job centre again. £12, I've got 2 kids at home. It doesn't do me at all. I told the job centre and I've put in a reconsideration explaining the situation. To be honest with you, I've been left completely high and dry. I've had no feedback at all from the job centre, and every time I've been in to see someone, I'm getting nowhere. I'm being passed from one person to the next. I said to them today, how can you expect me to live on £12 for 2 weeks? I get my kids every Friday, Saturday and Sunday, so I have to get food. And that's why he's at the food bank. Sadly, Craig's story isn't the only one. We got this story from Cass again. The West of Scotland CAB reports of a client that is reliant on food parcels that he is receiving from local churches. The client is currently homeless and has received sanctions of 2 weeks to his JSA claim after missing a signing on date for the 2nd time this year. The client cannot claim hardship payments or a crisis loan, so the Bureau referred him for a food parcel. 2 weeks later, the client approached the Bureau again as he still had no money, couldn't afford travel to the job centre and is still reliant on food parcels to survive. So between these 2 case studies, we can clearly illustrate that more and more people are being forced to rely on food banks to feed themselves, and there's clear links between sanctions and the growth of food bank use. But it's not just individuals we're talking about here, it's families. And family relationships are being put under strain as a result of welfare reform and the punitive sanctions regime. Again, thanks to the likes of TPAG. We have one case here that was about a young girl whose father had been repeatedly sanctioned, and as a result he couldn't afford to visit her anymore. His daughter phoned him to ask why he didn't love her. Not only is this a heartbreaking story, but we have to consider the long-term damage that sanctions are doing to family life. In addition to benefit cuts, thousands of lone parents are now facing the sanctions regime. Parents of school children face new sanctions, threats, and many are unclear about their rights. However, DWP research has shown that the effect of benefit sanctions on lone parents' employment decisions and moves into employment suggests that imposing a sanction has only negligible effect on the parents' labour market decisions. It is therefore important to think about the effect that this has on the child and on child poverty figures, which rose in Scotland for the first time in over a decade last year. Many parents and many people want to comply with the system, and for lone parents, the reasons that they aren't are linked often to ill health, caring responsibilities, or simply forgetting appointments due to family pressures. Many lone parents aren't even aware that they've been sanctioned until the notice of the reduced benefit payment, and it is important to acknowledge the additional strain that this puts on them and their family. We need to stop thinking beyond the short term. The Social Security Advisory Council say that when a parent comes off benefit prompted by sanctions, this results in poorer quality employment, lower earnings, and job instability. If we as a society are serious about supporting people into high quality, sustainable employment, then we need to change the way we're doing things. So we'll put a brief bit in here as well on the impacts of sanctions on disabled people. So again, these figures are going to be slightly out of date. Between October 2012 and June 2014, UK-wide there were 1.5 million sanctions applied. 21% of these were against disabled people. Breaking this down to a Scotland level, it would suggest that there were 30,000 disabled people sanctioned in Scotland in this time. 61% of ESA sanctions were against claimants with mental and behavioural disorders. It's clear that the system is failing disabled people, and it is unable to recognise the detrimental health to the health of disabled people that sanctions have. I added this slide in after an event we did in Inverness last week, because it's not something we actually talk about very often, which is rural issues. So we had an event in Inverness where we met with a group who said one of the biggest problems they have with conditionality is compounded by the issues of transport. They said they had examples of people who needed to have overnight stays in order to access their accommodation due to the location of the job centre. And they also had problems in the winter with poor buses. If your bus is only once or twice a day, it's very easy to miss your appointment. And whenever this was raised with the DWP, I don't think they were particularly keen on making any changes to make it better for people. So the impact on sanctions on organisations. So research carried out through the Welfare Trackers Project, a joint project between the Poverty Alliance and GCVS, found the most pressing issues faced by organisations as a result of welfare reform were increased workload and pressures on staff, a need for training on staff and welfare reform, more challenging caseloads, the impact on delivery of key work, and an additional numbers of referrals and organisations. There is a clear concerning message that welfare reform is having a negative impact on organisations within Glasgow, and organisations are needing greater support to deal with the significant wave of changes impacting on them at the front line. The last point in this slide here as well particularly highlights the increased hardship faced by service users and clients affected by welfare reform. So we spoke to organisations then about the biggest concern that clients were raising with them. These were the removal or deduction of benefits, benefit delays, hardship, and increased conditionality and sanctions. As a result of these changes, organisations are having to change the way they work, including providing advice and support, developing links with other organisations, and reallocating funding. While organisations are working well in responding to welfare reform, this is not a long-term solution. Organisations cannot be expected to continue to provide extra services under additional financial strain without something giving. Finally, very briefly, I just want to talk about the impact of sanctions on society. Sanctions are forcing the most vulnerable people in our society further and further away from the labour market. I've already talked earlier in this presentation about how sanctions can make it more difficult for people to find jobs, but let's also remember that employers need employees too, and this current model of working is not sustainable for a healthy labour market. Sanctions leave those people who already have little money with nothing. People on low incomes are the people most likely to spend their money in the community and support their local economy. By issuing more sanctions, we're taking that money directly out of the local economy. Finally, we also need to think about any savings made in sanctions and how they can be negated by spend in other areas such as health, social work and criminal justice services. At a time when we talk so much of preventative spend, we need to think about how the sanctions regime fits in with this. So, conclusions. It's clear that sanctions can have a negative impact on all aspects of a person's life: their housing situation, their relationship with their family, their ability to eat healthily and regularly, their self-esteem and their mental and physical health. But it goes beyond that. Individuals are not the only ones feeling the strain of the punitive sanctions regime. Organisations are suffering. They're expected to provide additional support and advice without additional resources. Organisations are being stretched to capacity, and we have spoken with many who are now so focused on mitigating against the impacts of welfare reform that they are able to focus on much else. Finally, there's the societal cost of sanctions. Taking money from people's pockets and pushing them further away from the jobs market isn't just bad for the individual, it's bad for us all. So that's it. I'll just give you my contact details there as well, if anyone wants to keep in touch. Thank you.